The title of this lecture is What is History Part 2? It is, of course, a continuation of What is History Part 1, in which we will explore Renaissance historians and the historians of the 18th and 19th centuries, ending with Karl Marx.
As we leave the Middle Ages, we now come to the modern era, and we will examine several modern views of history, represented by 6 key thinkers: Leonardo Bruni, Edward Gibbon, the Marquis de Condorcet, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Leopold von Ranke, and finally, Karl Marx. Leonardo Bruni's most important work, his History of the Florentine People, is a history of the city of Florence and its rise to power in Italy during the 14th century. Bruni ascribes the rise of Florence to a republican form of government, which fostered certain civic virtues such as courage, strength, and industriousness. In this, he is very much in the same tradition as the Roman historians. Likewise, like the Romans, Bruni predicted the eventual decline of Florence once these virtues were abandoned. Bruni is also credited with being the first to divide history into 3 periods: Antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the Modern Era. Like most humanists of his day, Bruni regarded the Middle Ages, the period in between the much revered Antiquity and his own modern era, as a period of darkness and ignorance. His historiography sought to demonstrate the recovery of the values and virtues of antiquity in the life of his own people. His return to political history and his division of history into 3 periods have earned Bruni the distinction as the first modern historian. Now we come to Edward Gibbon, an 18th century English historian. Gibbon was educated at Oxford University, showing promise as a student until his unexpected conversion to Catholicism at age 16. His horrified father sent him to Calvinist Switzerland, where Gibbon reverted to Protestantism, but by this time had become more of a skeptic in matters religious. His historical masterpiece, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, is, as the title indicates, the history of the later Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity. Gibbon proved no friend of the Christian faith. He considered Christianity to be one of the major factors in Rome's demise, and considered the triumph of the church under Constantine, quote, the triumph of barbarism and religion, end quote. Gibbon identified several causes for the rise of Christianity in late antiquity. One of these was the inflexible zeal of Christians, which made them very aggressive in proselytizing. Another was the Christian claim to miracles and divine intervention on their behalf, which further enhanced their fanaticism. A third cause of the rise of Christianity was the austere morals of the Christians, which exalted the virtues of humility and meekness, which in turn were antithetical to the more robust militaristic virtues upon which Rome was based. As Christian morals became more and more pervasive, Roman military virtue eroded, thus making the empire vulnerable to invasion. And that is how Christianity, according to Gibbon, caused Rome's demise. Next we come to Marie-Jean-Antoine Nicolas de Caratat, the Marquis de Condorcet. His work, Sketch for a Historical Picture of the Progress of the Human Mind, inaugurated the progressive view of history, the belief that humankind was on an inevitable march toward greater understanding, tolerance, and freedom. Like virtually all thinkers from the Enlightenment, Condorcet believed the medieval period of history to be a particularly dark and dismal time, ridden with error and intolerance. He writes, man's only achievements were theological daydreaming and superstitious imposture. His only morality, religious intolerance. In blood and tears, crushed between priestly tyranny and military despotism, Europe awaited the moment when a new enlightenment would allow her to be reborn free, heiress to humanity and virtue. Condorcet believed he had discovered the one thing necessary to free humankind from error. He writes, having long been engaged in pondering the means of improving man's fate, I have not been able to avoid the conclusion that there is actually only one such means, the speeding of the progress of enlightenment. Now, with this faith in enlightenment, Condorcet formulated a view of history in which humankind would inevitably progress to an age of perfect rationality and freedom. Again, he writes, "How welcome to the philosopher is this picture of the human race, freed from all its chains, released from the dominion of chance and from that of the enemies of its progress, advancing with a firm and sure step in the path of truth, virtue, and happiness. How this spectacle consoles him for the errors, crimes, and injustices that still defile the earth, of which he is often the victim. It is in the contemplation of this picture that he finds the reward for his efforts on behalf of the progress of reason and the defense of liberty." Notice what this does to the study of history. History now serves a future-oriented purpose, to effect social and political change. The study of the past is valuable only in terms of its service towards this utopian goal. Ironically, Condorcet died while imprisoned by the Jacobins, the left-wing radicals who eventually came to power during the French Revolution. He thus became a victim of the very movement he so confidently espoused. As we move into the 19th century, we notice a shift in historical thinking. While the progressive view of history is by no means repudiated, it is transformed by the influence of philosophical idealism, a school of thought associated with Immanuel Kant. Idealism was largely a reaction against the rationalism and empiricism of the Enlightenment. It questioned the unexamined confidence Enlightenment thinkers had in their ability to know reality according to reason and observation. Idealism maintains that ideas that exist in the human mind form the basis of reality. The question then becomes, how do we account for the correlation between the ideas in our mind and the external world? Kant maintained that there really was no necessary connection between the two. Our knowledge of reality is wholly mediated through the ideas or categories of the mind. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, a student of Kant's, found this unsatisfactory. He wanted to be able to account for the apparent correlation between mind and external reality. How is it that the ideas of the mind and the external phenomena which they make sense out of come to be in relation to one another? Pursuant to these questions, he developed a comprehensive system or worldview rooted in idealism. At the heart of Hegel's system was the absolute. This is pure spirit or mind, which operates in and through the collective mind of humanity. This absolute mind, operating in and through human beings in response to their environment, is in a state of flux and development. It develops in terms of paired oppositions. For example, mind and matter, infinite and finite, freedom and non-freedom, internal and external. Through the agency of human minds, the absolute mind seeks to resolve these contradictions through an ultimate synthesis, which represents the development of the absolute on a higher, more advanced level.
This dynamic, aptly described, though not by Hegel himself, as thesis, antithesis, synthesis, expresses the unfolding of reality in the natural order studied by scientists in philosophy, in religion, and in politics. In political life, Hegel saw the dynamic as the gradual emergence, unfolding, establishment, and then further unfolding of human freedom. This freedom was embodied for Hegel in the modern nation-state. It was the perfect synthesis of the freedom of the individual and the stability of the nation. His philosophy of history placed the emergence of the nation-state at the center of the historical process. This nation-state represents the full realization in time of the absolute and a perfect synthesis of freedom and order. History is the story of the process of the realization of freedom. This was Hegel's philosophy of history.
Finally, we come to Karl Marx. Marx had been a student of Hegel's philosophy while studying law at the University of Berlin. He became involved in a group of students known as the Young Hegelians. The Young Hegelians were a politically radical group of thinkers who adopted the structures of Hegel's thought but employed them in materialist and even atheistic terms. For example, consider the question of labor-employer relations. For Hegel, the relationship between an employer and a laborer might reflect a specific idea in the mind of humankind at a given historical moment. For example, the idea of justice, that is, giving to each person his or her due. This idea produced in the Middle Ages the economic institution of feudalism. Labor was exchanged for subsistence and security. So justice in the Middle Ages meant obedience on the part of the serf and protection on the part of the feudal lord. Again, continuing with Hegel's thought, as the idea progressed throughout time, it transcended feudalism and came to manifest itself in a market-driven economy in which wages were paid to the laborer for a specific amount of work. Justice then came to mean an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. Marx turned this idea on its head. His response would be that the material relations between the serf and the feudal lord produced the idea of justice as service and protection that prevailed in the Middle Ages. As economic conditions changed, the relationship between labor and employer changed, resulting in the new definition of justice as labor for wages. But here is the dirty little secret for Marx. These material conditions always serve the interests of the ruling class. Justice, for Marx, is simply a conceptual cloaking of exploitation. So how then did Marx view history? What was his philosophy of history? Hegel viewed thought as the moving force in history. History for Hegel is the unfolding of the absolute in freedom as expressed in the nation-state. Marx, on the other hand, understood material subsistence to be the moving force in history. Thus, Marx viewed history as the gradual realization of the liberation of the proletariat, that is, the working class. Like Hegel, he viewed history in terms of paired oppositions, but these oppositions were not metaphysical, that is, spirit versus matter, infinite versus finite, but conflicting economic interests. The thesis, as it were, for Marx was the working class throughout history. The antithesis was the ruling classes that exploit the labor of the workers. And the ultimate synthesis would be the triumph of the proletariat in a classless socialist society. This triumph would be realized through violent revolution.